What more do we know about the size of this incursion?
Yeah, well, Gareth, it's getting a bit bigger as time goes on. The Russians haven't contained it and certainly not pushed it back. So at the moment, it seems as if it's about 30 miles long and about 18 miles deep. Now, in terms of the territory of Ukraine and Russia, of course, that's very, very small. But in military terms, that's pretty big. And it's a lot bigger than some of the areas that have been fought over for months in Ukraine proper. And Russian sources last night, and this is Russian sources, were reporting fighting at settlements like Tolpino, Zurovili, and Obshikolodes. And those are settlements outside of the areas that we now mark as being under Ukrainian control. That doesn't mean to say they're under Ukrainian control, but the Ukrainians are obviously fighting outwards from this pocket to the northwest. So I don't know how far they'll go. There's got to come a point at which they dig in, because the further they go, the more vulnerable they themselves are. And that will depend on the logistics, how much reinforcement they've got. Are they able to supply their troops and their equipment properly? But the interesting thing is, whatever the Russians have said, they've not been able to reduce the size of this pocket, and they can't really stop it growing just at the moment.
And what do you make of these allegations of chemical weapons being used?
Well, chemical weapons are being used by the Russians throughout the whole battle area. I mean, they use CS gas, which is not illegal in domestic society. It's a riot control agent, but it is illegal on the battlefield because CS gas in concentration is very deadly, and it forces troops out where they can then be shot, interestingly.
Michael, we've just lost you for a second there. We're just trying to connect. Oh, there we are. It looks like you're back. Michael, can you hear me okay?
I can, yes, yeah.
Perfect. Sorry, so we just lost you when you say about CS gas being used in military settings.
Yes, it's illegal to use CS gas on a battlefield because it can have a big effect on the battlefield in forcing troops out of their locations, and therefore they're vulnerable and they can be shot. So funnily enough, CS gas is legal domestically, but illegal internationally. And the Russians have been using CS gas for months now, all the way around the front. And they've used other forms of gas, lots of allegations of that. So gas is being used and chemical agents are being used in this war. So these allegations are plausible, but they're easy to make. And a lot of people think that gas is being used. People who are not specialists think they see the use of gas when they see smoke or they see other sorts of things. So we've got to be very careful about this. But certainly gas is being used in this war. And has been for some time.
The main front across Ukraine, that semicircle effectively of around 1,000 kilometres or so, is the key focal point, let's be honest, in this conflict. Are we seeing yet any signs that Russian forces are being pulled away from that front to redeploy them towards the Kursk and Belgorod regions?
Not definitively, no. I mean, only anecdotally. It looks as if the Russians, the first response was to get the reserve forces in, get the border forces who are close, I mean, by close, I mean about 90 miles away in Vovchansk, where they've been pushing, and the Ukrainians have been basically eating them up. The Russians may feel that they can do this without diverting some of their big units, their better units from further south. But the Ukrainians have made it pretty clear by what they've put into the pocket that it will take quality troops to dislodge them. So at the moment, I think the Russians are trying to play it both ways. They're trying to rely on very poor troops, conscripts and their border forces, and their internal troops, the Rosgvardia. I mean, there's 400,000 Rosgvardia, but they're just internal order troops, and they're not much good on a conventional battlefield up against a determined opposition. So they're not much use. At some point, I think the Russians will have to redeploy more elite units from further south. So far, we can't say that they have. Lots of allegations kicking around. None of them can be confirmed as yet. Give it another couple of days and we'll see. But honestly, Gareth, this battle, it will be quite a battle. This will be measured in days and weeks, not weeks and months. The Russians they'll put whatever is needed to get rid of this pocket. This is Russian territory. They'll do whatever it takes. And so if they have to redeploy their big units, they will do. I'm absolutely certain about that.
The Ukrainians have proven to be wily operators. They have to be. Numerically, it's as much smaller force than the Russians. Population-wise, when it comes to resupply, it's a much smaller force than the Russians. Do you think if Russia redeploys, they will take that opportunity to have a pause and a bit of relief in the areas where they're currently fighting? Or do you think that Ukraine may have plans to try and advance in areas where maybe there's been a bit of distraction taken away from?
Well, I think the Ukrainians would be glad of any sort of relief further south, particularly around the southern area of the Donbass, around Chasiv Yar and the road to Pokrovsk, and in the defense of these two key cities that we've talked about many times on Sky, of Slaviansk and Kramatorsk. If the Russians take Slaviansk and Kramatorsk, then they take basically the whole of the Donbass, and that's what they're trying to do, I'm sure, before the winter. If the Ukrainians can distract the Russians from that, if they can get any relief there, I think that they'll be grateful. But the Ukrainians have got to be really careful, because they've committed what look like reasonably big forces to creating this pocket. They're good forces, and if they're taking them away from where they're needed further south, the danger is that they'll have to withdraw from this pocket at some point, and they may lose in the south as well. So this spectacular operation will not be seen as successful, and they'll have paid a price for it on the front that really does matter, around that semicircle you were talking about 1,000 kilometers, 600 odd miles of fighting. But in the south, in the Donbass, it's really critical. So if the Ukrainians, if this fails for Kiev, then the operation fails and they lose ground on the central front. If it succeeds, then they get all the political benefits of this success, all that sort of sense of momentum shifting, and they get some relief on the rest of the front in the Donbass, which will get into the winter when they can dig in a bit more safely.